Okay, welcome back to Ride On. I'm here with Micah, who I think for all of you that are in the micromobility space and read reviews every day, you definitely have come across Micah's work if you don't know him from his YouTube channels as well. Micah, day in, day out, is of course on electric, writing amazing reviews of all types of micromobility vehicles, from of course the latest in electric bikes to Micah actually gets a hold of like the most interesting, golf cart, neighborhood electric style vehicles as well from China that I think he's the first to always see, and I'm jealous of. So yeah, welcome, Micah Toll. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, James. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to bring Micah on because there's been some, unfortunately, some tragic incidents recently of electric bike deaths here in the United States, and that has been getting some national attention. And specifically, that attention has been coming from the New York Times, who has put out a couple of articles recently on electric bike deaths. One of those deaths was someone dying in Encinitas, California, which is where I live and what we talk a lot about, the kind of area of Southern California where there is a lot of micromobility adoption and e-bike proliferation. And the New York Times piece was a piece that unfortunately I felt like it took a really hard stance on kids riding e-bikes and on the idea that we were going to blame the victim, the unfortunate tragedy of a young man who died on his electric bike, versus like trying to look at the bigger problem. And just as I was trying to write my notes down, Micah, you came out with an amazing piece, I thought, really rebutting the New York Times piece. So maybe if you could, for the audience, I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about that piece and what you're trying to accomplish, and pointing out some of the failures of the New York Times piece.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm glad to see that there is a conversation starting around safety. It's unfortunate, though, that the conversation has sort of taken this turn towards victim blaming that we saw in multiple articles from the New York Times, where instead of looking at the situation where we've unfortunately seen so many accidents between e-bikes and cars and saying, how could we improve the situation, and focusing on what is actually killing e-bike riders, instead the conversation appears to have shifted so far towards why are e-bikes dangerous, which I do not think is inherently true at all. If anything, I would argue that they are much safer as lighter machines that have a significantly lower impact on everyone on the road. And to me, it was just simply egregious to see these articles go this direction. It's like if someone were mugged on the subway and we said, well, why were you walking around with a wallet, instead of how can we make the subway safer, kind of thing. It's just kind of blew my mind that this was the direction that major thinkers, major publications were going with this. And there are so many options out there when we really look at road safety, from improving the way roads are built. Every 20 to 30 years, roads are redesigned, reconstructed. And it's so easy to say, all right, let's go in and design this for different users of the road, instead of saying, let's redo this just for cars. And on roads like where that poor boy was killed in Encinitas, that would have made such a big difference to have protected bike lanes. But, there are so many other things to look at here. I know that you and I have talked about this idea of enforcement, that a lot of traffic violations go unenforced. There's a lot of distracted driving out there that, it would be so easy to put traffic police out there citing people for being on their cell phones, because much of the time these crashes between cars and bikes, they're not malicious. Sure, there are some drivers out there who harbor ill will towards cyclists, but the vast majority of them are distracted drivers. They're not setting out to hit or kill a bicyclist. And so to target all of this distracted driving, I think, would also be a major part of this conversation. And yet somehow we keep coming back to this idea of why are e-bikes dangerous, which I simply think is incorrect at its foundation.
Yeah, well said. So a couple of things there. One, I just want to call out a sentence here from your article, which I thought was so good, which was, of course, after there was the tragic death, there was also another collision that occurred with a BMW where they had to pull a kid out from underneath the BMW who survived that. But again, it's a very terrible collision. And you wrote here, apparent praise is lauded on Encinitas for soon afterward declaring a state of emergency for e-bikes. which is a bit like saying we could just solve the school shootings crisis if kids would stop walking into all those damn bullets. Which, God, that was so well said, sort of similar to your subway analogy earlier. What is it? What do you think it is about vehicles where clearly I'm here in Encinitas. There's a lot of kids on e-bikes. There's a lot of kids that goof around on e-bikes. They do wheelies. They ride on sidewalks sometimes. And as a driver, clearly you see that, you think, oh, these kids are acting bad. It's dangerous. I'm in a car. Why can't they be like me? And yet at the same time, like, I have all the collision data. You can get all the collision data for California, for all of the United States via, open source databases. What's clear is there's way more violence that occurs in cars, around cars. But people, again, I know people in Encinitas as an example, or people that laud the praise on Encinitas for cracking down on e-bikes. Like, these are good people. They're rational people. Why do they think e-bikes are the problem? Like, what do you think this is culturally, where people don't realize it's the cars that are the problem? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just this sort of inertia that people have in their minds that cars exist. It's what they've known. To them, it's what roads are for. And bicyclists are seen as, an incursion on the road to many people, not because they outwardly have any, ill will in their minds towards cyclists, but just that they see the status quo of roads for cars as the way it's meant to be. It's the way it's been since they've grown up, and it's the way that it sort of should be in their minds. And so, to me, I think that's what's sort of poisoning this conversation, is that they don't see the way the law is written, in that cyclists are treated just as any other motor vehicle on the road in terms of access. Instead, they see it as like, yeah, okay, we let them on there into our space. And I think that's what's really, sort of unfortunately misguiding a lot of the policymakers. And to your point about, you often see a lot of these kids sort of bringing a bad name to e-biking, or just regular bikes, popping wheelies, riding on the sidewalk, stuff like that. First of all, I think that there should be enforcement for cyclists and e-bikes as well. There are rules of the road that apply to us on bikes. And, if we're riding outside the law, I think that should be an issue as well. But at the same time, as long as kids are riding legally, when I see them popping wheelies, I think that's awesome. And if anything, it demonstrates that their vehicle control compared to a lot of drivers that certainly don't have the same control or awareness of their own vehicle. So I don't see that, as a problem at all. I see the more kids are out on bikes, getting practice on the road and being more aware of their vehicle, all the better.
And I should also give you credit, in terms of you being outspoken about e-bikes and others being regulated. I know here in California, there's a bill up for actually making e-bikes require a license if they're underage. And I know you wrote an article where you basically agreed with it. That's Tasha Bonner's bill, who's actually she's the San Diego County congresswoman. She's proposed that bill. And as far as I know, you are supportive of that, from what I saw in reading your article when you published that piece. That was all of 3 weeks ago. This is all looking pretty quickly. But as far as I can tell, I'm not sure if I support that bill, but I'd be curious to hear why you do and why you think that'd be important to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think an important point about that bill, like you mentioned, that it only would require a driver's license for e-bikers when they don't already have a car driver's license. So it's basically for anyone who hasn't gone through driver training. And to me, I know this is an unpopular opinion in some cycling circles, but to me it makes sense, because if someone is going to be operating on the road, then I think that they should have been trained in the rules of the road. Simple things like, green light, go, red light, stop is ingrained in everyone's mind, whether they took driver's education or not, whether they've ever driven a car. But there are a lot of other nuances involved with right of way, with turning, with looking, with blind spots, all of this stuff that if you haven't taken driver's ed or you haven't driven a car, you may not be aware of, especially, just the perspective of someone who's driven a car, knowing that there are areas that you can't see around you, or knowing to make eye contact with drivers, that sort of thing. If you've never had this type of training, that it's something that you'd be operating on the road without any idea of. And it's interesting because I did get a lot of pushback from that. And a lot of people said, you shouldn't make kids go through licensing courses just because they don't have a driver's license if they're going to ride an e-bike. that's something the parents should teach them. Well, I can tell you there are a lot of parents driving out there that shouldn't be on the road. So I'm not sure that this is one of the things that we should entrust to parents. There are plenty of educational things that we have regulated, that there's a reason that parents aren't required to teach math and science to their kids, that we have professionals do it. And so I think if you're going to have a 16-year-old on the road that's never learned the rules of the road, that a simple e-bike driver's license is the correct way to go.
Yeah, okay. And I think that I respect that. I respect that opinion. And I think maybe even as part of this, what I would love to see is, should we be rewriting, should driving in general just be something that's a little bit more of a privilege that can be revoked, right? I think it's pretty easy to get a driver's license. It's pretty easy to keep your driver's license. You could make multiple infractions in things that are very deadly to yourself and other people, and still be driving. So yeah, I mean, as part of this, I'd love to see California. I don't think the driver's license test has changed at all over the years. Clearly, there's a lot more vehicles on the road than there was back in the day, including a lot of smaller vehicles. So yeah, I'd be all for potentially relooking at licensing in general as it relates to operating a vehicle on a road. And again, my worry there is, people die on e-bikes, so we regulate the e-bikes. No thought of, should we be looking at size of vehicles? Should we be looking at more enforcement? And then, one final thing here, Micah. So clearly, living here at Encinitas, I have some purview into the streets and areas where we've had issues. So this year in Encinitas, we've like many cities have adopted a pledge of Vision Zero, meaning we have a goal to get to zero pedestrian and cyclist deaths in our city. Unfortunately, this year we have lost 2 people now. The kid on the e-bike, and we also lost a young man on New Year's Day to a pedestrian death. That was a hit and run death. There was no camera enforcement on that intersection. There's no suspects for who killed that young man. In both those instances, those two people died in what are the 2 dangerous, basically, areas of Encinitas from a traffic collision perspective. This is all data, again, that you can pull up. I'll pull up the graph that could show you those 2 intersections as being the most dangerous. We have technology, Micah. It sounds like where you live, you actually enforce with technology, with speed cameras, with red light running cameras. Why don't you think more people are calling for adoption of simple technologies that we have in place today? These are theoretical technologies that we know also are proven to basically reduce traffic violence. What do you think is stopping cities from adopting this much faster?
Yeah, where I live, red light cameras and speeding cameras are just the norm. People understand that if they're going to speed, if they're going to go through an intersection, they're going to get a ticket in the mail. That's just how it works, and I think it works very well. In the U.S., obviously, it's, a lot of this politics is more local. There's a lot more decisions made locally, and I think a lot of people see this issue as not pertaining to them. They think, yeah, okay, I speed, but I do it safely. I would never hit anybody. And so when they see it that way, they think, well, I don't want a red light camera. I don't want speeding cameras because I'll get caught speeding safely, kind of thing. Again, it's this idea of inertia. It's what they've been used to, and they don't want to see this change, especially if it affects them in a negative way, instead of seeing it as, for a greater good, that if everybody would just drive safely, everybody would be safer. And unfortunately, I think it's just so hard to change minds in mass. I'm not sure how we best do that. I think, a lot of your efforts are going in the right direction to help do that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating challenge here. It's frustrating to hear how, like, where you live in Israel, you're in Tel Aviv, right, Micah?
Yes.
Yeah, at Tel Aviv, and talk to friends and throughout Europe in cities where they just don't really deal with this issue. They have speed and traffic cameras, and they're surprised to hear about the number of collisions and the high speed collisions and how this happens, because this is kind of a solved problem. Here at Encinitas specifically, just to highlight, in 2020, cameras voted out on a 3-2 vote. The kind of leading council person, Joe Moscow, who actually pioneered this, came out and said, even nothing has changed, and hundreds of people are still getting these ridiculous fines. This is when Moscow was referring to the idea that people get a $400 ticket for running a red light. And of course, now we're dealing in that area where they pulled out these cameras with people that have died. So It's very sad to see. I will say to our council, I credit the people that are still actually on the council, both the mayor, who's Tony Kranz now the mayor, was a council member at the time, and then council member Kelly Hines, both voted against this. So there's they're still actually they can make change, and we hope they do, because I will give them both shout outs. They're avid on their e-bikes. So, I know they want a safer place to be. And then finally, the interesting about the New York Times article with a cherry pick, there's actually two other very serious collisions in San Diego the week they reported on the electric bike accidents involving two people. One was a 56-year-old woman that was killed on an electric bike, and also a 32-year-old man was in critical condition in San Diego. The woman that unfortunately died was killed by a Chevy Silverado. The other person that's in critical condition was hit by a Ford F-150, which, and again, I'll put up the chart, are the two deadliest vehicles in America by quite a stretch. So the Chevy Silverado is the most deadly vehicle in America, I think basically every year for the last 5 or 6 years, and then Ford F-150 is right behind it. Sort of interesting because the Ford F-150 is actually a better seller than the Chevy Silverado, but a lot of people believe it's the way the Chevy Silverado front end is basically built. It's hard to see over it, and so therefore you just kill more people with that vehicle. And again, Mike, it's just interesting to give a Pulitzer Prize winner in the New York Times writing about this. They don't cover two other deaths in, within a 15-mile radius of where the death did occur, maybe because it's not someone underage. But again, it's just it's so easy to see the people at the highest part of the leaderboard, a Chevy Silverado, a Ford F-150. No one talks about those. No one talks about regulating that. Do you see that changing anytime soon? Do you see that actually we do anything to take some of these more deadly, what are clearly more deadly vehicles off the road, on top of doing things like camera technologies?
I think the only way this changes is if enough people want it to change. It's got to be a grassroots activism issue. It's got to be people going to their local city councils, demanding that laws change, that traffic laws are enforced, that safe cycling infrastructure is built, that safety is taught to drivers as well as e-bike riders. Anyone who's on the road is trained properly to use that road and to share it in an equitable way, the way it was designed to be. Is it going to change? I don't know, but I know the way that it can change.
Yeah, that's a great point. So then finally, what's your advice to parents? I think, to people that have kids that clearly, I grew up riding a bike. I'm sure you did too. I think, most kids do. What's your advice to parents now who are reading these articles in the Times and other places, hearing of these terrible collisions? And of course, we should also highlight there's terrible collisions in cars all the time that don't involve e-bikes. But what would your advice be to parents who are thinking about getting their child an e-bike and, want to, of course, allow them to ride like they might have growing up?
Sure. First of all, I am incredibly pro e-bike, and I think that any kid who needs a way to get around, that e-bikes are a wonderful form of transportation. And they also free up parents that aren't then required to, leave work early, pick up their kids, chauffeur them around, that sort of thing. At the same time, I think the parents need to make their kids painfully aware of the danger, not the danger of e-bikes, but the danger of all those distracted drivers out there that can and will hurt them if they're not aware of them. And unfortunately, a lot of that impetus for safety is thus put on e-bike riders to protect ourselves from that danger on the road. So I think that it's not something that can be glossed over. Kids, teenagers need to be aware of this. There's also, a personal decision that needs to be made by parents at what age they think that their kids are responsible enough. I've seen, 10, 11, 12-year-olds that are great responsible e-bike riders, and I've seen 40-year-olds that should have their e-bike taken away. So I'm not going to say that there's a certain age that this needs to be done by, but there is a significant level of responsibility here. And the last thing that I would say, and this might sound kind of strange, but to anyone, especially younger riders that are new to it, that wants to get into e-bikes, taking some form of motorcycle training is incredibly useful. When I got my motorcycle license, it made me a better bike rider just because it taught me so many things about the mechanics of two-wheeler operation that just don't come intuitively. We all know how to ride a bike, but there are so many other sort of safety issues to being aware on the road that I learned through Motorcycle Safety Foundation classes. And even watching YouTube videos on, motorcycle riding and motorcycle training can be incredibly useful to anyone who is on a two-wheeled vehicle.
I love that. That's so good. And I've been trying to get my motorcycle, going through the motorcycle license process myself. More just out of curiosity. I'm still not totally comfortable on a motorcycle, but I agree with that, and I think that's actually a great piece of advice for kids out there as well. Well, Micah, I appreciate the time, and it goes without saying, but we appreciate all the work that you do and the content you create. I think it has a very big impact. So thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for taking some time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, James.
Okay.